Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Rob Conley, Nick Seidler, and Adam Balderstone, and this is our latest session of Game Lab. We are going to be covering the afterlife in gaming and talking about what happens when your characters die, but we'll also be talking about Nick's experience at GaryCon. So, Nick, why don't you walk us in with your report?
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. Because of Gary Con, I unfortunately missed Game Lab 3. So I wasn't blowing off our Game Lab. I was just gaming. So I think that's always a plus. So um, I had a chance to go to Gary Con 10. So this is the 10th Gary Con. And it was March 8th through 11th in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, at the Lake Geneva Grand, which is it's the old Playboy Club in Lake Geneva, actually. So a little bit of history there. And also kind of interesting because that was the home to Gen Con 10. So this being Gary Con 10, Gen Con 10 was held in the same place. So, which was kind of fun. And those people who don't know what Gary Con is a convention that was started by Luke Gygax, one of Gary Gygax, the inventor of Dungeons and Dragons. One of his sons started the event the year after his father passed away, because at his father's funeral, a bunch of people got together and actually played games and celebrated the life of Gary Gygax. So the following year, Luke Gygax put together a convention. It started very small. This year they had record attendance. I want to say they had about 2,300 people there, which is to now the biggest attendance they've had, and I think 600 more than they had last year. And it's a great convention. I highly recommend it. One of the things that I think are particularly neat, and I'll tell you some of the highlights of the convention. The best part about the convention is almost everybody who used to work at TSR in Lake Geneva returns, and it becomes a reunion of sorts to those people who were very involved in the early days of gaming. And so, and the way GaryCon registration works is when you sign up, there's different levels that you can sign up, but you get like gold or silver tokens, and gold tokens can be used to sign up for games that some of the luminaries in role-playing game history are running. Okay, so I with a standard silver membership, I got 2 gold coins that I could use to sign up, and I signed up for an adventure with Merle Rasmussen, who is the inventor of the Top Secret role-playing game, which came out in 1981. And so I had a chance to play in a game with him, and he runs great games. And he's also one of the writers for the new Top Secret New World Order game that just came out. So I had a chance to sit at the table, play the most recent iteration of Top Secret, and had a really good time doing that. So you could end up at a table with Ernie Gygax or Luke Gygax. Mark Miller, who was the inventor of Traveler, was there this year. So I had a chance to chat with him. He ran Traveler games, so nothing like being at the table with the guy who invents the game. It was kind of fun. He actually did a session which you had to roll up your characters, and a lot of people might forget, but you can actually kill your character during character creation in Traveler. So just getting through character creation is one of those kind of fun things that you. Another thing that I want to just talk about, which was particularly fun, there were 2 events that I really enjoyed on top of the game with Merle Rasmussen. One was that Frank Metzer, who was a longtime TSR employee, Gary Gygax's right-hand person, and did a lot of editing for TSR, but he's mostly well known for writing the Dungeons and Dragons Red Box, the basic set of D&D. He actually opens his home on Wednesday night. And on Wednesday night, he actually invites whoever's going to GaryCon can come over to his house. He and his wife have opened the house. There's food there. There's like a suggested donation of $5 to just kind of help out with the food, but it's not required. And he does like a lot of cool stuff. And he demonstrated a brand new role-playing game that he was coming up with there. He gave away free copies of the original, like the play test for this game. He would sign them for you. He would he gave away free dice, the old kind of plastic wax D&D dice from like 1981. So you could get 1 or 2 free dice when you were there and kind of hang out and chill out, and it was really a great time. And he even sold, there's a pretty famous book by Gary Gygax called Role Playing Mastery, which if you can even find one now, I highly recommend it. But Frank had a case of these books left over from 1987 and was selling them for $5 a piece. Wow. So there was no way I was passing up on that. So I spent my $5 and got a brand new mint copy of the Gary Gygax Role Playing Mastery book. And the last thing, another thing I want to mention was there was a really great event that was run by Bob Brinkman, who he's done writing for Goodman Games and stuff, and he ran the first ever Cyborg Commando tournament in the U.S. And Cyborg Commando was the first game that Gary Gygax wrote, along with Frank Metzer and one other person, when they left TSR. And they created, I think it was New Infinities, I think was the name of the company when they left TSR. And Cyborg Commando was sort of a cross between like Terminator and, kind of like the cyberpunk stuff that was going on in the 80s. And most people think of it as a game that's very complicated and hard to run and like you can't win. And I think Bob Brinkman and the other players that I played with were outstanding. They were like really good. It was a multi-round tournament, and I was fortunate enough to make it to the final table. And the players we had were great, and it was just a fun game. And Bob made it cool by making sure that there were prizes for everyone. Everyone at the final table won a box set of Cyborg Commando from 1987. So that was pretty cool. So I apologize for doing a lot of talking. We usually have a lot of discussion here, but I kind of want to give you guys the report of what that experience was like. Maybe you guys have some questions, and I can tell you what it's like if you go to Gary Con. So,
I'm just jealous in a good way. Yeah. Yep. I heard about it when it was in year 3 or something, and I always wanted to go, but it just never worked out. I mean, it's my eldest son's birthday when they hold it, and we'll see whenever I get out there. But did you see my city-state map at the Black Blade table by any chance?
Ooh, I apologize. I didn't get over there, so I did not see that.
So you had a presence there, Rob?
Yeah, Black Blade Publishing. They work with Osric a lot, and they sell a lot of OSR stuff. But they graciously had me send them some city-state map on consignment, and they put it on the table. Apparently, they sold out the first day. I should have sent more copies.
What format was the map in? Just out of curiosity, like was it a fold-out map? Was it in a book form?
It's actually published like the original map. It's a 34-inch by 44-inch map, and it's printed in 4 sections mainly because RPG Now can only print 18-inch by 12-inch posters, or in my case, 12-inch by 18-inch. And so what I did was I formatted the map so there was considerable overlap between the sections of like 2 inches or something, and I got permission from the Bloodsaw to release it, and I comped in all the Kickstarter backers because it wouldn't be right for me to force them to pay for it. So I gave them at cost copies for the print and gave them the PDF for free, and but sold it for everybody else, and it's done quite well. It's silver on RPG Now, and so anyway, Black Blade said, "Hey Rob, I saw this. Can you send us copies?" And we talked about it. We'll try 10, and so I sent them 10 copies, and they all sold. The only thing we'll do differently is next time I'll bag them up because apparently there was confusion over the fact that there's 5 maps per package. There's 4 maps forming up each a quarter of the city, and then I shrunk it down to make a single smaller 18 by 12 map. So you get 5 posters per the price on RPG Now.
That formatting's tricky. I get a lot of requests for large size maps of various kinds, and it's very difficult to do in the POD format.
Well, I tell you, I'm very happy with the RPG Now poster printer. I mean,
I think the options have expanded lately, haven't they? Have they increased the options on printing for that kind of thing, or am I just way behind?
It's been in place for the last 2 years, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
They axed the card format because I guess it wasn't printing right, and they substituted some other paper type. But the posters have been the way they are, and it's only recently, with the city-state and now the upcoming Wildlands map that I'm going to do for the Kickstarter, that I got to play with it, and I'm quite happy with it. This is a podcast, otherwise I'll be showing people the map, but...
We can put a link in. Remind me to put a link in. What was that, Nick?
Okay.
Well, I was going to say there were a number of people who were selling maps, so it's quite possible maybe I did actually see that, because there were a couple tables of people who had maps. I didn't know that you had done that one, so that's kind of interesting. So I also should give one other shout out, and that was for that Cyborg Commando tournament. There was one other game master I had in the earlier round who I thought did a great job, and that was Kurt Rausch. And he was there. I just want to make sure he gets the credit that was due to him because he ran our table the first round of that before Bob took over, who's also amazing. So, I was going to say one of the things I want to also let people know about Gary Con is if you're trying to get like stuff signed, that's the place to go. So a lot of people will carry around their old school books, and everyone there who's attending is happy to sign the book. So a lot of the early artists are there. Are there any
Ravenloft people there by any chance? Are there any Ravenloft people there that you know of?
Absolutely, yeah. So
okay. I might give you stuff to get signed next time you go, Nick.
Sure. For instance, James Lauder, who was the book editor of the Ravenloft, the fiction book line. I saw him there.
He wrote Night of the Black Rose, which is probably the best book in the series, in my opinion.
Yes, he did. So, and he'll actually be at a convention at my university in 2 weeks, a gaming convention called Consinity, which happens on April 21st at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. He'll be there too if anybody's looking to bump in. So.
Yeah, good thing about role-playing game designers, none of them are so jaded in their celebrity that they're at the point where they don't want to do autographs anymore.
Right. Hey, did you see the Into the Borderland that Goodman Games putting out?
I absolutely. So yes, that was kind of like a really great thing to see the fifth ed version of Keep on the Borderlands kind of expanded. They did have that there. It looked great. So yeah, I thought that was actually very cool.
So, and how different was it? Well, first off, have you been there in previous years? I couldn't remember.
I had. This was my 5th year, so I've been to half of them.
Okay,
so yeah.
So how would you say it's changed over those 5 years that you've been there?
The size. The first year I went, it was only 600 people. Mm-hmm. So much more intimate. The beautiful thing about Gary Con, though, is while it's tripled in size since I started going, or even quadrupled in size, it still feels like an intimate convention. So it reminds me of the very early days of Gen Con. I was fortunate enough to go to, I think, Gen Con 13 or something like that. And, where you see the designers in the halls and they're talking and you can, or they're at a booth, or they're just having food at the restaurant that's in the hotel, and you can sit down with them and have a chat, and like they're cool with it and they're excited to talk gaming. I think very few industries still have a lot of the people who helped begin them around, and I think this is their favorite event, the one they all go to. Mm-hmm. And so you have this great opportunity to engage with people. And again, no one has a problem if you bring up, 3 books for somebody to sign. Go, oh my God, I love your stuff. Like, could you please? Oh, of course I'll sign these. Yeah, no problem. Might be different if you roll up with a cart and go, can you sign these?
Yeah. Yeah, well, if you give somebody, some work, it's never.
50 copies of the same book that you plan to resell might be an issue, but
now is it entirely old school stuff? Is there new school material there?
No.
What's the overall range of material?
There's all sorts of stuff there. The newest version of Pathfinder was being played there. There's I didn't run it myself, but there were some new editions of the Doctor Who game that were being played. I ran a Doctor Who game there, but because it has an old school feel, I run the FASA game there. Though I do kind of obviously talk up the new Cubicle 7 game. But it's a mix of old and new. I think it has a little bit of the old flavor because the old guard is there, so to speak. And but yes, you can find all kinds of gaming there, including miniatures. Cards are there too, but much less enforced. It's much more of a role-playing convention. So miniatures and role-playing. Some of the old school historicals are still there too. So.
Okay, so did anybody else have other questions to ask about GaryCon?
Actually, I would love it if we all got together and tried to go there and did our podcast there one day. It'd be great to see.
I think that would be fun. I think that if we can manage it, we will. It would be an interesting experience. I think if I can go to a convention, that would be the one I would go to. I think.
And I would recommend that. I would recommend this convention for those people who have a long history of role-playing games. Definitely, this is the one to go to.
Well, when you mentioned Top Secret, that brought back memories of,
Yep.
and I think Top Secret's funny because it's one of these games, a lot of people probably didn't get the opportunity to play it as much, but everybody seemed to at least own it. It was always a little bit of a harder sell for your D&D group, but I remember
I had
Rob
a
is
friend
holding up his copy of Top Secret. I remember. I don't know which version I had. I must have bought mine in '87 or so, or like in the late '80s at some point. And it was a box set, and it had all kinds of like nice bells and whistles in there, as I remember.
I had a friend whose parents wouldn't let him buy D&D, so he ran Top Secret. It was the very edition that Rob has.
That was actually why I bought Top Secret. That was one of my
reasons.
Yeah.
So. Well, and I'll say this: Top Secret was my first ever role-playing game, and I never thought, I always saw the administrator, Merle Rasmussen's name inside of all the products. I never thought I'd ever sit at a table with him and get a chance to game it with the guy who invented the game, right? And it's interesting to be able to sit at a table with somebody who invents a game, because as we get games and we play them and we put our own spin on them and we have our own feel for them, it's interesting to see how they envisioned the game being played when they first came up with it. So was it anything unexpected, or did you like go, oh, so that's what that meant, or something like that? Well, it was actually like when I read Top Secret, I was very specific about the rules. So like, Top Secret uses a percentile system, and when things happen in it, you assume you're like, oh, I have to crunch this number, and then I'm going to roll the dice and I'm going to see what happens. When Merle Rasmussen ran the game, he was much more open and relaxed about the system than I had thought you were supposed to play it. So he was just like, nah, it's all about the story, man. Don't worry about crunching the numbers. I'm just going to assign a number and that's what you're going to have to roll. And it was a very different experience from how, when I picked up the book, I would play the game. I had a chance 3 years ago to be in one of the games that Ernie Gygax ran. And Ernie Gygax, the son of Gary Gygax, was at the very first ever table, and he played the very first ever wizard in the game. And so, if you've heard of Tensor's floating disc, he played the character Tensor and invented half the spells, and so you're at a table with somebody who is at the first ever D&D game, and he's running it for you. and it's just has a different feel than you might expect. And an example would be Ernie didn't map anything for us. He said, okay, you better find a mapper in your group. You guys walk down a 20 foot long corridor that's 5 feet wide. It opens into a room that's hexagonal, 40 feet across by 40 feet across, with whatever. And if we weren't mapping it, or if we didn't pay attention to it, we were lost, and our map got off pretty quick, right? So to know that was a part of the original game, this kind of sense of confusion and this, you only know a little bit of what's going on, definitely brought a different element to the D&D than when my friends would map out the rooms for me, and I would be like, oh, okay, I see where things are. I have a complete sense of knowing where I am. It definitely felt more dungeony to me, to be honest. So, but that's just an example. So I'm sorry, it's
a little echo there. Just to move on to the topic for discussion, we're going to talk about Afterlife in gaming, and I know this was sort of my topic, so if people need to expand a little bit, it's because the premise here is we try to do things that we actually do in our real table, and so I didn't anticipate people were just going to go around killing their PCs in order to get an Afterlife experience. It just so happens I had some deaths in my campaigns, and I was able to utilize the Afterlife. I also was able to run the Afterlife just as sort of like a that's the concept of the session type thing. But yeah, so I don't know. I guess first off, have you guys used the Afterlife in your campaigns? And we'll extend that to include things like characters becoming undead, even, or like we were before the podcast, I was talking with Nick, and we extended it to concepts like the Matrix and Doctor Who and things like that. So
yeah, beyond having characters become undead, I can't think of anything I've done with the Afterlife. But yeah, it's an interesting topic, though. It's something like when I look back on it, I'm like amazed I haven't done more with it.
I'm sorry, Rob, were you going to say something?
I have a little bit of different take. Basically, I really don't have much in the way of outer planes in my campaign. Basically, what the gods dwell on pocket dimensions. There was this book by an author named, I think, Richard Holstock, and called Mythical Woods, and it kind of inspired me. Basically, the premise is that, I think it's called Rye-hop wood. There's this wood in this guy's backyard as part of the local community, and it has a strange reputation. And when you enter the woods in such a way, it's like a whole nother world in there. And while the author doesn't really go in a whole lot of detail, other than the fact that you can literally spend years and go for hundreds of miles inside this wood, I was thinking about how is that possible? Here it is. So what I did is I called it a wold, WOLD, and basically the way I drew it was I take an ordinary map, and I would draw a boundary on it, a small boundary. And then I would take another piece of map and draw that same shape of boundary, but then draw a bigger boundary around that, and that will be the lower hemisphere of the wold. And then on another map, I'll take the outer boundary again. So I need two maps to map out one of these, one of the lower hemisphere, one of the upper hemisphere. And, you could travel, if you enter in the woods the right way and keep on traveling, it's like way bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. But if you just narrowly hit it, it might seem a little strange, but you'll quickly exit the other side and not knowing anything was wrong. So all my gods live in those woes. And I have 10 deities, and I have about 3 of them mapped out. One of them I published under my Point of Light, the one for Set, or Sarath, I called him in that. And as far as the concept of the Afterlife, they're like way stations. The spirits, when you die, you go there and you dwell there for a time, sort of like I guess if you were a Catholic, it would be like a purgatory, and then you move on. Everybody does that except for the elves, because the elves are, my conception of elves is they're tied to the world and they can't leave it. They can't go elsewhere.
Okay.
And in fact, they don't die. If you die as an elf, you'll resurrect. In terms of the campaign, you're gone, but a century or if you're a particularly notable elf, it might take several millennia before you reappear, but you will eventually reappear after your spirit healed.
Now, is that stuff that you consider gameable, or is it something that your character dies and you just know the character goes there, but you wouldn't actually play out being in the world?
Well, I never ran an all-elf campaign, but if I did, and the party had a total TPK, then that would have been a thing.
Okay. That
they were all appear a century or two later, and the campaign picks up from that point. But the only time it really did come in game is when a PC liked it and they decided to make their elf character a resurrected elf. And he really lived a couple centuries ago, and he died a traumatic death, and now he's resurrected and he's back for more. And a friend of mine used that. I have two friends, twins, Dwayne and Tim, and Dwayne used that in his game as well. It's one of the PCs were a resurrected elf as well. But no, the only effect is that the handful of times that I went off plane to another world, basically I kind of play it like alternate worlds, Doctor Who, not just a pocket dimension, but it's like a alternate reality. The elves can't go.
Yeah,
they get to the gate and they just bounce off, and they can't leave.
And I should say that you also in this it's possible for in this discussion to apply to things like characters not actually dying but just going to these places, like the Paladin in Hell kind of a thing.
I really de-emphasized that. The one time I remember any details about, they went to like this crossroads inn to pick up some information about a threat, and then they came back. And then actually it was my friend Dwayne who used that concept more. He ran a campaign where it was a bunch of people from another alternate reality invaded the world, and we had to deal with that in his campaign. And they had these floating cities. It was pretty trippy. He did a pretty good job with it. A little different take than what I did, but that's the point. For having different referees. And but by and large, my planar adventures are actually journeying into pocket realms. For example, the domain of Set it's the swamp of Acreon, and the players went and rescued King Arthur. My version of King Arthur is named King Arthos. And they had to deal with the Son of Set. I don't know if you guys remember the Dark Tower module, but I used the Son of Set out of there as the antagonist for that part of the adventure. And one thing is that while they were trying to approach, they ran into one of Set's guardians, which was a giant dragon turtle. And the island that they were on was the back of the dragon turtle. And the dragon turtle became aware of the party and raised itself out of the water and said, "I am taking you to my master." And the party was like, "Oh, what do we do? What do we do?" And my friend Dwayne, who was playing at the time, said, "I got it." And he pulled out they had the Codex of the Infinite Planes. And the way it worked was it allows you an alternate way into these pocket dimensions. And it did it by creating a bubble around you and transporting everybody inside the bubble. So he went up and he asked the dragon turtle if he minds sitting on his head to read his book. And the dragon turtle said, "Go. Yes, beauty human, you may do so." So he sat on the guy's head, spent the 10 minutes or so it is to activate the codex, and sure enough, the bubble appeared around him, the dragon turtle's head, and he popped him back himself to the sea state of the invincible overlord with the severed head of a dragon turtle.
The first time I encountered a dragon turtle as a player, I really underestimated them based on the name alone. Nick, were you about to say something? It looked like you were.
Yeah, that was a great story and tough to top, to be honest. But I was gonna give an example of Afterlife opportunity or adventure that I played in, which was game mastered by a friend of mine named Matt Lininger, and he was actually very good at creating Afterlife scenarios. So, in our game, my character who was a fighter, and this is D&D that we're talking about. Had fallen in love with another character, right? But it was kind of like a secret. So my character was like secretly in love with this female cleric, and that female cleric actually died or was taken to another plane of the afterlife. And so my character vowed, knowing that there were things like resurrection built into the game, to save this character, and it became this big part of the campaign where this fighter was trying to save this person. So we ended up in sort of an afterlife scenario where my player, with the rest of the group, right, the rest of the group kind of knew then that this character like was in love with this other character, and now truth came out kind of thing, because it was always played very like subtly, and then the rest of the group agreed to try to go to different places in the afterlife to try to find the lost love of this fighter character. And the way my friend Matt played it, and I have to give him a lot of credit, was we went to a number of different planes, if you will, of the afterlife. So, we went to the very happy afterlife. We went to, a purgatory, if you will. And of course, this character ended up being in one of the planes of hell, right? Like, that's fun of the adventure, is to go to the places you don't expect. And it wasn't because of that the character was evil, but that the character, in order to save some other people, had given her own life to save some other people in the planes of hell. So we ended up having to go to one of the planes of hell and confront the person who basically she was an indentured servant to try to rescue her. And that was a really interesting game, because especially when you have a good guy, you expect the good guys to be in the good places in the afterlife. But good guys are willing to do good guy stuff, including trade themselves for somebody else who's rotting in hell. So Matt had a really great set of adventures that he had for us, in which the path in the afterlife was different than what we would have expected. And I think there's something great there as a tip to other game masters to say, we all have an idea of what the afterlife is. None of us are there. So you can kind of play with that concept, and it doesn't have to be sort of like the traditional afterlife like everybody expects, but you can kind of play with the concept a little bit. So,
yeah, you've reminded me of a story, actually, where I have run a game involving the afterlife that I'd completely purged from my memory because it went really badly. So I actually do have a story to share. This is a cautionary tale about how it can go very wrong. But yeah, I used to work in a game store back in the 90s, and a friend of mine that Brendan knows, Robert Rosenthal, gave me an adventure to run as a demo for Cult in the store. It was an adventure he wrote for Cult, where early on the characters all die, and they don't quite realize they're dead. But in Cult, the universe is an illusion, and so you never really die. If you experience death, you kind of go into the afterlife to some extent and probably reincarnate. But or end up in hell or something. But basically, I was running it. I ran this demo in the store after hours, and this couple showed up. This is like a pretty heavy horror game, and this couple shows up with like their 7-year-old kid. And they're like, "Yeah, we want to play," and I'm like, this is a horror game. You probably don't understand to play. Oh, he loves horror movies, and I'm like, oh, great. And so, first of all, I'm like, I don't care how comfortable they are with it. I'm basically like censoring the adventure at every point. So I'm like, I've already kind of defanged the adventure as I'm running it. And these people could not take. They just. could not in any way like follow any of the clues. I kept getting more and more heavy-handed with the clues of where they needed to go and what they. Hey, there's like they needed to go to this factory, and it's like everyone they talk to, boy, have you heard about what's going on at the factory? I was just like really trying to yell, and they would just be oblivious. It's like they just, okay, well, we're gonna hang out at the bar some more, and and then they started, and they kind of get into a fight. It's like nobody could die in that adventure, so I didn't even have the final game master option. I'm just gonna kill the party and like end the adventure. It's like that wasn't an option. It was just. It was literally the game just turned into purgatory where I was stuck there with these players who would do nothing.
That's kind of fitting, though. That's kind of fitting that it would become purgatory for you.
Yeah, exactly. So that is my warning. If you were in the afterlife, remember your players cannot die at this point, and so they can linger and haunt you for hours.
So I had an interesting twist on that very issue, which I'll get to now, and then I'll explain some more stuff.
Yeah, I'm done.
I ran my players through. I was using a Chinese setting where there's like a Chinese type hell like Diu, and they had like this one had 8 levels, but it's bit modeled on the 10 courts of hell, and the players had to go there while they were still alive in order to get something. So they were sort of adventuring into the various realms of the afterlife and going into these little pocket realms that existed as well. But then later in the game, another character was having a duel with a really powerful character, and he didn't back down at any point in the duel, even when it turned against him, and he got obliterated, and he died. And so he actually went to the afterlife. And I decided that there was like this zone between the courts and reality, and that's where you go when you first die, and that's sort of like your opportunity to accrue good merit, or material objects that you can use to bribe the various judges of hell, and so this player was not having any of it though, and so the way that the afterlife worked here is if you die in this sort of middle state, then you go to the to the different courts. And so he just ended up killing himself midway through the adventure, and so he only got so far. But the interesting thing was, in order to incorporate the other player characters into that thing that was going on with him, I had a ritual performed that allowed them to go there when they were dreaming. And so their souls sort of projected into the afterlife in their dreams. And it was sort of amusing because the players who were being projected there were actually having a good time and enjoyed the afterlife. And the player who was there didn't want to be there. He just wanted to move on to his next character. So I think it's one of those things when you game the afterlife, you have to be aware of the players' tastes for sure, because it's a very different flavor. And some people will like it and take to it. Some people won't really enjoy it. But yeah, so that's my story at least.
One, at the start of the podcast, you said that there's different ways to play the afterlife, and I think people who've been listening to us here at Game Lab know that I generally run a Doctor Who campaign. Doctor Who is obviously a science fiction show, and that doesn't really delve into the afterlife per se, because one of the concepts of the show is that everything can be described by science. Even within the fiction of the show and the series, there are different ways that the afterlife comes up. So within our campaign, I've had a chance to run a few multiple Time Lord stories. So going off of some of like the great Doctor Who stories, like the 3 Doctors or the 5 Doctors or Day of the Doctor, we've had an opportunity to have some of those Time Lords, because it's a time travel game, even those Time Lords who have died, right, or regenerated into new Time Lords, or the same Time Lord, a different body, are able to come back in some of the stories. So that's one concept that I've used within that science fiction game to bring back sort of an afterlife concept, in which sometimes it's fun to have those characters come back. Likewise, you mentioned the Matrix, the Time Lord repository of all knowledge, and that includes people when they're going to die, they download the Time Lords download the knowledge of that person into the Matrix, and they kind of live on. But there's a couple other tricks that I found in the game that works really well, and that is alternate timelines. So one thing that I do when I run the Doctor Who campaign is I'll sort of have an anniversary game. So if our group is 5 years on and everybody's kind of changed characters and stuff like that, sometimes I'll run a game in which characters can be plucked from their timeline and can come to the table and play again. Or another trick that I like to do in the campaign is to return to a module, especially if that adventure had a couple of deaths in it or something like that, and allow the players to replay it as if they were in a different timeline or a different dimension. And so that's kind of interesting because sometimes people go, oh, I wish I had never run into that room. My character would still be around. And all of a sudden they find themselves in an adventure where they're that old character and they can change their timeline. And that's a really interesting thing to do because some people run back into the room again and take the odds against the dice because they feel like that was the right thing to do originally. And other people will completely avoid that quote-unquote timeline and intentionally change the course of the game. And so I think there's something neat in a game that's science-based or science fiction-based, of course. I think it's neat how people deal with a second chance and, in a sense, get an afterlife or a second chance at their course of action, and how some people will try to change it and some people won't, but will hope the dice go better. So
yeah, and I guess, how do you guys handle things like, and obviously, Nick, this wouldn't apply to Doctor Who, but maybe there's something I'm unaware of, but like resurrection and raised dead and things like that. What if those always seem to be things that people either they sort of embrace the idea of it, or they do something to make it less prevalent in the campaign. I've had some GMs that just won't even go there.
It's there. It's pricey enough that they don't want to die, even with its availability. But I had parties clubbed together to resurrect a dead party member. But I mean, other than taking a hit as far as your health go for a little bit, I use original D&D, and basically you're down a week if you get a raised dead cast on you. And never had a resurrection now. That's way high level. And campaigns rarely ever progress to that point. But I had plenty of raised dead. 5,000 silver. It's a pretty big hit to the party treasury.
I played in a great game at Gary Con 6, just because we talked about Gary Con at the top of the podcast. And Simon Todd was at that game, who writes for Monty Dots, and Bob Brinkman, who I talked about earlier, was a part of that game. Andrew Gowan was playing at that game. And we were actually in an adventure, and this is an interesting way of looking at the afterlife, in which we had somebody who was strong enough to do a resurrection spell. And as we were going through the campaign, we actually came face to face with the major bad guy in the adventure. And the major bad guy was like a white or something like that. You know what I mean? Some ghost or whatever. The group decided to cast the resurrection spell on the villain rather than on any of the players.
I had something
which
like that.
simply made this character human, and then we could defeat it at a much better level than we had.
Interesting.
So,
That's a great idea.
to the group of players, because using this very difficult spell, and just as just a few minutes ago, Robert was saying, you come out of that and you're not strong and you're weak. They used resurrection as a way to defeat this undead villain, which I thought was brilliant. It was one of the best games at a table at a convention that I'd ever played in, and everybody was just sharp and clever, and I think there is a place in a game for resurrection, not just to defeat a villain like that, but some characters, especially if they're particularly interesting or valuable to a storyline. Sometimes you don't want to lose that character if they're important to a plot thread. So I think there is a place for resurrection spells and bringing people back from the dead or whatever it might be. So
yeah, we actually had a resurrection in the Dungeon Crawl Classics game I'm playing in 2 weeks ago, where I'm playing the wizard in the party, and I just got really super arrogant because I had a number of recent wins, and the thief and I went alone into this other wizard's tower and got mauled by the tigers guarding it, and I went into negative hit point territory, but he flat out got killed by the time the rest of the party showed up and took care of the tigers, and so I was able to be healed by the priest of Cthulhu in our party, which gave me a great religious awakening, and I've embraced Cthulhu as my personal savior now. But to bring the thief back, we had a magical artifact, which was I think the blade of resurrection or something, and you have to cut a limb off the person you're resurrecting as part of the ritual, and we could not remember if the thief was right-handed or left-handed, though. So we took a guess, and we guessed wrong. So
them's the breaks.
Them's the breaks. Yeah. Since then, he's managed to get like a weird plant hand that's like grown in place. That's another thing that he's traded for, which doesn't work like a proper hand. So he doesn't quite have a handle on it yet, But yeah, so resurrection has been an interesting and new thing. But I actually haven't used it very much in campaigns I've run myself. I don't have any stories from the game master side where anything particularly innovative's happened with it.
Well, I play in a lot of settings where there aren't necessarily rules specific to that sort of thing, but there are gods that exist in the setting where that sort of development might emerge. And those are often fun, where the players kind of have to try something and see if it helps bring somebody back. And sometimes it does, sometimes it has unusual, unexpected consequences. What about playing things like when the characters become undead or their bodies get turned into something after? Like I was telling Adam on our Tuesday game that I had, or actually maybe I wasn't. Adam, were you at the Tuesday game this week, or was I?
I was not at the Tuesday game.
I was probably telling Kenny then that that I had turned my players into flesh golems after they died one time, and so they awakened and they were now in like flesh golem bodies, and and it's do you guys allow for that sort of thing in your own campaigns? I guess being like a Cyberman might be like the equivalent in Doctor Who.
Absolutely.
I haven't had anybody stupid enough to try to do that until quite recently. So there's a player who's on a collision course. He wants to become undead, and he's thrown him.
Oh, he's trying to become undead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wants to be an undead overlord. But he's committed to the concept, which is the key to making it work. Most players, when they mess around with it, it's just a way of getting more power. Now, some of that with this player, but he's like it's a difference between, lawful greedy and really this is a part of my character. He really wants to become an undead overlord, and he's committed to the whole thing. And the current player is committed. So, I have role-playing campaigns I have refereed campaigns where players played evil PCs and rolled with it. And, so I'm going to roll with this, see how it works out. But in the past, when players tried to flirt with the concept, they know it was not without consequence. And it, for the most part, it always makes them go, whoa, maybe I'll do this instead, Because, if you become an undead overlord, you better have created a bubble around yourself that you can, where you live your daily life, because normal society isn't going to accept your...
No. Well, there's a whole slew of issues with that, because number one, you have to rise to the level of overlord in the undead hierarchy. Like there are presumably other undead that are just as qualified, if not more, to become the local undead overlord.
You've been dead one day. Yeah. We're supposed to respect you. Come on.
But the holy crusaders that are going to come after you are just, a nightmare to deal with. So I feel like undeath is something that's easy to balance out, provided the consequences are there in the setting. Though obviously you can there's a lot of power when people become undead. But I think if with the right group and the right game master, it can work.
I think there's one other way of, we can look at this concept of like undead in its own way, and you just made me think of something just because you brought up the Doctor Who thing, and that is that sometimes it's worth killing characters, but the characters aren't actually dead, right? So the disappearance of a character and the possible future reappearance of a character in a campaign is a trick that I think can carry a lot of merit, right? So what I mean by that is like everybody sees this character die, right? It's a Hollywood plot we see used all the time, right? We saw James Bond die, but that's allowed James Bond to go undercover deeper because everybody thinks he's dead now, and he can like kind of like do this other investigation. So, taking the opportunity to fool the rest of the party into thinking that something is going on, I think is a really great trope for a lot of different role-playing games, where you think that somebody is dead and like people mourn them. I've had situations in which characters have presumably died in my Doctor Who game, and then they went undercover or whatever, and then I've forced the other players through the machinations of the game. I didn't force the players, but like they were forced to give eulogies for this person, but the person was actually alive and listening to the eulogies about them. So they didn't know, which was like a really neat twist, because they had to like, yeah, I didn't always get along with Bob, but he was there when I needed it. And I remember the time Bob needed me medical, and I was for sure gonna like bleed out. So like I think that was good. Bob was my favorite guy, and I don't know how I'll live on beyond this. And to have that person be there and hear the eulogy, it which I made all of the characters, like the lead character made all of the characters give a eulogy for this character. They thought the character was dead, so it was interesting to hear what they actually had to say, only for a number of adventures later for that person to actually be alive. And then there was this holy smokes moment, like, what? He's not really dead? Like, okay. And I think there's a lot of value to that, playing with the concept of death, and then bringing that character back while they weren't actually dead is, in a sense, an afterlife scenario, right?
Okay, yeah.
How is everybody else has moved on? Everybody else has a different opinion of what happened. Now this person's back in the mix. What does that look like?
No, that could definitely be. I would love to see a game where the GM sort of plans way ahead and has an NPC fake his death for some grand nefarious scheme, and then, a year or two later brings the character back. That would be very gratifying. But you'd have to do it right.
It's all about the circumstances. I mean, if I can pull it off, I'll pull it off. But I just go with the flow so much that it's rare. Like in real life. I mean, how often can you pull that off?
Well, you wouldn't want to be doing that that would be something that you wouldn't want to throw at your players probably more than once, number one, because if it happened multiple times, it would be,
Every time we kill the bad guy, he comes back again, why bother?
But what I'm thinking is if you had an NPC who had some kind of plan in mind, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the exact scenario is, but if he like wants revenge on the party, or if he just has some other thing that he's trying to achieve, and faking the death, would play into that. It might be an interesting thing to sort of have happen and have it, but really wait it out. Like not, do it and then be like, okay, next week he comes back. Like do it and then never mention it again for like 2 years and then have him come back.
I think Adam brought up something really good that I think's worth talking about and exploring, and that is that making of how you handle a villain who comes back, because we all have certain villains that are great villains, and in order for them to be great villains, they have to be mortal, right? Like you have to be able to kill them, or you have to be able to defeat them. It's great to bring back those villains, but you can't do it so often that the players feel like there's no real chance to have a victory or to have a win. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, Adam, but I think that was a great point.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that is the point itself. But what was I going to say? I did have a point that I just lost. But yeah, I will say this as an aside while I wait for my point to come back. Is Brendan, you were right. You did talk to me about the flesh golems, but it wasn't at the game. It was at the Friday podcast.
Oh, okay. I was mistaken.
So you're not crazy.
All
so
right. I'm just very stupid.
To.
That's all. I just
no.
wrong.
Just,
but no, I think that's a delicate point too, because you can I found players react very differently. I tend not to bring my NPCs back from the dead after they've been killed by the party like that, unless it was like planned in advance. You know, like they were obviously doing something to protect themselves. The reason why is because I found that players, when I did do that in the past, they can react negatively to it. So it's the kind of thing that you have to be careful about when you do. I would say it's sort of about having the right group for that sort of development. If they're on board with it, I would say go for it. If it's a group that is going to feel like that's an underhanded GM trick, you might want to be cautious about it.
Yeah. I do remember what I was going to say. As we are in the process of faking a death in the Dungeon Crawl Classics game.
Should
right
you be
now
saying
as
this?
players.
Are people going to be? Are you spoiling anything for people in the game? Or
No, well, I'm a player.
Oh,
We're the
okay.
players doing it. So,
Okay.
the GM knows about it. So, but yeah, and it's due to a weird, unforeseen thing. Because in this adventure, there's a wizards tournament going on, and one of the wizards the rival wizard in this tournament stole the fighter's horse at one point. You know, the party's horse. We had to negotiate to get him back, and then he wasn't sure the horse he was getting traded back was really his horse, or it might be an illusion. And so I cast a spell magic to, get to check. I'm like, look, if it's an illusion, it'll be fine. And the spell magic will make it go away. And I didn't even believe the horse wasn't real. I just did it to comfort the fighter. You should never flippantly use magic in Dungeon Crawl Classics because
I was going to say that. Yes. Why would you just use magic for a trivial purpose like that?
I know
That was stupid.
There's a whole cascade of effects that are going to come from this decision. So keep listening. But I got an amazing roll. I rolled a 20. It's like fantastic, you think. But not only that, I destroyed, instead of just casting the spell on the horse, I also destroyed every potion in the party. It's like the priest had all these like healing potions, all water now and everything. And everyone's magical items stopped working for 3 days. And it was just, but that's just the beginning. That was funny by itself, but then like basically we were negotiating with this other wizard, and it turns out like a few days later this thief shows up in my tower. She breaks in through the window, and it turns out she is actually masquerading as that other wizard because she stole that wizard's invitation and was like there in disguise. And basically she was being a high level thief. She could use scrolls, so she had like all these scrolls in her robes that she was using to cover up the fact she wasn't really a wizard. She was just using scrolls, and I had destroyed every one of her scrolls. So right now she's like, okay, well look, let's work together. You can help me fake my death so I can get off this island and everything. So we're in the process of she's gone from being enemies to now we're kind of forming this uneasy truce where she's going to help me with some things. But yeah, I don't know. So we'll see how this whole faking a death thing goes. But we're thinking of faking a duel between each other, and her then having her wizard identity be dead, and then being the thief instead. But it's complicated. But
you want to hear my Dungeon Crawl Classic story?
Please, yeah.
I was in on the playtest for Dungeon Crawl Classic, and Joseph Goodman asked me to run a session at a local convention, so I did. And you guys heard of Operation Unfathomable by Joseph Schultes?
Oh yeah.
He played a wizard in that game, and he had one spell, an enlarge. So we start off the adventure with the Emerald Sorcerer adventure. I forgot his full title. So they go to the dungeon door. Then they go to the entrance. It's the first door of the whole module, and it's locked, and they were debating what to do with it, and Jason goes, I will cast enlarge on it. It's my spell. We'll enlarge it, it will pop out of the frame, and we'll be inside. There we go. Yeah, hey, that's a good idea. So we cast it, and he too rolls a natural 20. The door expands to like some 2,000% of its normal size. So I rolled, okay, dude, it's popping out there like a bat out of hell. I'm going to roll a d6. 1 to 2 is the left to you. 5 to 6 to the right to you. 3 to 4, it coming head on to you, and you got to make a dexterity saving throw. And I rolled a 3. And he rolled a save. And he failed. And he had 1 hit point. And he dies. So it was the first adventure I ever ran where the character was literally killed by the door, the very first door of the dungeon.
I too have a door death story. I've probably told it here before. There was a Ravenloft adventure anthology. I think it was called Book of Crypts, and it had an adventure in there on in Lamortia, and you go to the domain lord is connected to this mad scientist who's kind of like Victor Frankenstein, and you go to his estate, and the door is so weathered and ruined by the climate that it's got these thick splinters coming off of it, and I can't remember exactly, but I think it did like a D2 damage or something like that, and it was enough to kill one of my first level characters in the game, and so he knocked in the door and he got a splinter and he died. Or he died. I can't remember if he died or if he passed out. But either way, it was a really sort of it was very anticlimactic, but also probably one of the most memorable moments. It's one of the books I wish I kept because I really want to go back and see if I was running it right, if it was if there was anything in there that I misunderstood.
It is funny in RPGs how anticlimaxes often are the most memorable things. Like theoretically, you'd think anticlimaxes should never be memorable, but they're always things you're like, wow.
I had a player in one of my groups who we had a big like final scene with the bad villain in my Ravenloft campaign way back in like 2001 or something, and it just became a really pathetic retreat on the villain's part right away. He ended up dying like wedged in a window, and I know I've told Adam this story many times before. But the point of it was very anticlimactic. But later on, one of the players came back to me and he said that was the best like final showdown with the villain I've ever had. And I was like, why? Because I thought it was just terrible. And he said no, because we killed him early on and you let it happen. You didn't do anything to like prevent it. He died embarrassingly in a windowsill. And so
it makes it real.
Yeah, well, I think what it was is he just felt that like I wasn't shifting the scenery behind the scenes on him, and he appreciated that. So sometimes anticlimactic stuff, it's also just it's sort of, it doesn't feel gratifying in the moment as a GM sometimes, but it's better in the long haul, and it can be memorable. So,
well, and I think there's a great reminder there that as we play games, it's about the entertainment of everyone at the table.
Yeah.
And while we're expecting like our machinations and our plans as game masters to be memorable and great, that's maybe not what the players are looking for. Maybe the players just want to get out of there with their hides intact for a change, and they're happy to get ahead of the game for a chance. So, like, absolutely. However, I love your knock knock who's dead story. So like that's a
yeah, that was definitely a fun one. But we've gone past the 1 hour mark, so I'm gonna end the episode there. But we'll be back. Me and Adam are gonna be back in the next day or so with our Return of Condor Heroes discussion. On Tuesday, I'll be putting up my session recording of the Lady 87 campaign, and on Friday, I'm very excited. We're going to be doing the House of Flying Daggers movie. So, we did Hero on Friday, and I'm really, this is my favorite in the series. So I'm looking forward to that. And then after that, we'll do Curse of the Golden Flower. It's part of sort of a sequence of films, and yeah. So we will be back on, and we will talk to you later.